January 17th, 1945. Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. Helen Schmidt's hands trembled as she stared at the white ceramic plate in front of her. Steam rose from something she had never seen before. Two pale, fluffy rounds of bread smothered in thick, creamy sauce, dotted with dark specks of pepper and chunks of what looked like meat. The smell hit her before she could look away. Rich, savory, almost overwhelming after months of thin soup and stale bread. Around her, 23 other German women sat frozen at long wooden tables. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sounds in the mess hall were the clatter of metal serving spoons against steel pans and the steady hiss of steam from the kitchen. Outside Wisconsin, snow pressed against the windows. Inside, warmth wrapped around them like a blanket they didn't trust. Helen was 28 years old. She had been a nurse in Hamburg before the capture. She had treated soldiers with frostbite, civilians with burns from Allied bombs, children dying from starvation. She had watched her city crumble under waves of fire from the sky. She had learned to survive on almost nothing. And now, 6,000 miles from home, her enemy had placed this in front of her. This impossible breakfast. They expected death. They got biscuits and gravy. Her fingers gripped the fork so hard, her knuckles turned white. Across the table, Margaret Weber watched her with sharp, calculating eyes. Margaret was 35, older than most of the women here. She had worked in a radio propaganda office in Berlin. She had written the words that warned German civilians about American cruelty, about torture, about systematic starvation of prisoners. She had believed every word she wrote because the state had trained her to believe. Now those words echoed in her mind as she looked at the food. This has to be a trick, Margaret thought. They want us to trust them before they hurt us. To Helen's right sat Elizabeth Hoffman. Everyone called her Lisa. 22 years old, the youngest among them. She came from a small village in Bavaria where she had worked as a medical secretary. She had never left Germany before the war pulled her into its machinery. Her hands shook worse than Helen's. Her eyes were red from crying. She had barely slept since they arrived at the camp 2 days ago. But what happened in those 2 days would become a question that haunted Helen for the rest of her life. A question that started with a simple breakfast and ended with the complete destruction of everything she thought she knew about enemies and friends, truth and lies, her country and theirs. The journey across the ocean had been long and terrifying, packed into the hold of a transport ship with hundreds of other prisoners. The smell of unwashed bodies and sickness. The constant fear that the ship might sink or that American sailors would come down and do the things the propaganda films had promised they would do. But nothing had happened. They were given thin blankets. They were given water. They were counted and logged and processed with bureaucratic efficiency that felt more disturbing than violence because it was so ordinary. When they finally arrived at Fort McCoy, the cold had struck them like a physical blow. None of them had proper winter coats. The thin military jackets they wore were designed for European winters, not this brutal Midwestern freeze. Guards had ushered them off trucks and through gates topped with barbed wire. The women had expected cells. They expected concrete floors and darkness and the smell of fear. Instead, they got wooden barracks with bunk beds and clean mattresses. They got wool blankets that actually provided warmth. They got a coal stove in the corner that one of the guards lit without being asked. The air inside smelled like pine and soap, not fear, not decay, just clean wood and warmth. Helen had refused to unpack her small bag that first night. She sat on the edge of her bunk and stared at the wall. This is how they break you, she told herself. They make you comfortable. They make you trust. Then they take it all away, and the fall breaks you worse than if they had just hurt you from the start. Margaret had unpacked with careful, deliberate movements. She folded her few possessions and placed them under her pillow. She wanted to maintain some sense of control, some structure, in a world that had stopped making sense. Lisa had simply crawled into bed and cried herself to sleep. The next morning, the bell had rung across the camp, clear and metallic in the frozen air. Guards appeared at the barracks door and gestured for the women to follow. No shouting, no rough handling, just a simple motion and a few words in English that none of them fully understood. The women had followed because they had no choice. They walked across frost-covered ground toward a large building with windows that glowed yellow in the early dawn. The mess hall. That was yesterday. Their first meal had been oatmeal. Thick, hot, sweetened with what tasted like brown sugar. It had filled their stomachs in a way nothing had for months. Some women had cried while eating. Others had eaten in silence, afraid to show any emotion. Helen had eaten mechanically, her mind trying to solve the puzzle. Why feed us well? What do they want? Today was different. Today the smell was different. Today the food looked completely alien. An American cook moved down the line of tables, placing plates in front of each woman. He was young, maybe 25, with red hair and freckles that reminded Helen of a boy she had known in school before the war. He smiled at each woman as he served them. Not a cruel smile, not a mocking smile, just the kind of automatic pleasantness that service workers everywhere seemed to carry. It made Helen's skin crawl because it was so normal. How can you smile at your enemies? The cook reached their table and placed plates in front of Helen, Margaret, and Lisa. He said something in English. His tone was friendly. He pointed at the food and made an eating gesture, then walked back toward the kitchen. The three women stared at their plates. Lisa leaned close to Helen and whispered in German. "What is it?" Helen shook her head. "I don't know, Eo." Margaret spoke quietly, her voice tight with suspicion. "It looks like some kind of bread with sauce, but the sauce is white and thick. I have never seen anything like it." Around them, other women were having the same whispered conversations. Nobody wanted to be the first to try it. Nobody wanted to be the first to if it was poison. The fear sat heavy in the room despite the warmth, despite the smell that made their mouths water, despite their terror. Helen looked toward the front of the mess hall where American soldiers sat at their own tables. They were eating the same food, the same white-covered biscuits. They ate with casual efficiency, talking and laughing between bites. One soldier noticed the German women watching and raised his fork in a kind of salute, grinning. He took a large bite and made an exaggerated expression of satisfaction, rubbing his stomach. "See," the gesture said. "It's good. It's safe." Helen looked away. Her training as a nurse kicked in. She studied the food with clinical detachment. The biscuits were pale gold on top, soft-looking, almost like they would fall apart if touched. The gravy was cream-colored with visible flecks of black pepper and small chunks of what was definitely meat, probably sausage based on the smell. The whole thing steamed gently, releasing waves of scent that cut through the mess hall like a memory of better times. Her stomach growled. She had not realized how hungry she was until this moment. The oatmeal from yesterday morning had worn off hours ago. Her body needed food. Her mind needed safety. The two needs warred inside her. Margaret spoke again, her voice barely audible. "They want us to eat it. Look at them watching us." Helen glanced up. Several American guards stood along the walls. They were not threatening. They were just observing, waiting. One of them, an older man with gray hair and sergeant's stripes, met Helen's eyes. He nodded slowly and pointed at his own mouth, then at her plate. The message was clear. "Eat. It's okay." Helen's hands moved before her mind caught up. She picked up the fork. The metal was cold against her palm. She touched the edge of the fork to the biscuit. It was soft. Impossibly soft. Nothing like the dark, dense rye bread she had grown up eating. This bread had no resistance. The fork sank into it like cutting through cloud. She lifted a small piece. Gravy dripped from it back onto the plate. The smell intensified as it came closer to her face. Butter, flour, cream, pork, black pepper, salt. Her brain cataloged each scent automatically, even as fear screamed at her to stop. This is how they kill you. This is the trap. But the American soldiers were still eating, still laughing, still alive. Lisa watched Helen with wide eyes. Margaret's jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in her cheek. Around the room, all 24 women had stopped even pretending to do anything else. Everyone was watching Helen Schmidt decide whether to trust her enemy. What would happen when she finally took that bite? Would the taste match the propaganda warnings, or would it reveal something far more dangerous than poison? The answer would change everything. But first, there was something else these women needed to understand. Something about the world they had left behind and the world that had captured them. Because the real shock was not what the food would taste like. The real shock was why it existed at all. 6 months ago, Helen had been in Hamburg on the night the bombs fell heaviest. The night the sky turned orange and the air turned to fire. She had been working a double shift at the military hospital when the sirens started. Everyone who could move had rushed to the basement. Those who could not move had to be left behind. She remembered their faces, the ones in beds who could not walk, the ones who understood what it meant to be left. The building had shaken like it was trying to tear itself apart. Plaster dust rained from the ceiling. Gas pipes ruptured, and the smell of fuel mixed with smoke. Helen had held a young soldier's hand in the darkness. He was 19. Both his legs were gone from a mine explosion. He kept asking for his mother. The bombs kept falling. When it was over, when they finally emerged, the hospital was still standing, but the neighborhood around it was gone. Just rubble and fire, and the screams of people trapped under collapsed buildings. Helen had worked for 36 hours straight, treating burns and crush injuries, with supplies that ran out after the first 12 hours. She had watched children die. She had watched old men die. She had watched a pregnant woman die. American bombs had done that. American planes flown by American pilots who went home to American families and probably ate American food just like this. How dare they feed me kindly? Helen's hand shook harder. The piece of biscuit and gravy wavered in front of her mouth. She could still turn back. She could still refuse. She could maintain her dignity and her hate and her sense of who the enemy was supposed to be. But she was so hungry, and she was so tired of being afraid. Helen opened her mouth and placed the food inside. The taste hit her like a physical force. The biscuit dissolved on her tongue, soft and buttery and rich in a way she had forgotten food could be. The gravy was thick and creamy and salty with an undertone of sage and pork that made her think of Sunday mornings before the war, when her mother would make breakfast and the whole family would sit together at a table that no longer existed in a house that no longer stood. The warmth spread through her mouth and down her throat. It was not just temperature. It was comfort. It was safety. It was the feeling of being cared for that she had not experienced in so long she had forgotten it existed. Helen swallowed. The food settled in her stomach like an anchor, heavy and real and undeniable. She took another bite, then another. Her vision blurred. She realized she was crying. Tears ran down her face and dripped onto the table, but she could not stop eating, and she could not stop crying, and she did not understand why this simple act of eating breakfast felt like her entire world was breaking apart and reforming into something she did not recognize. Around her, the dam broke. Lisa reached for her fork with shaking hands. Margaret closed her eyes and took her first bite. Other women across the room began to eat. The sound of forks against plates filled the mess hall. And mixed with that sound was the quiet, almost silent sound of women crying while they ate. Not crying from pain, not crying from fear, crying from confusion, crying from relief, crying from the terrible realization that everything they had been told might have been wrong. The sergeant with gray hair who had encouraged Helen to eat walked slowly through the room. He did not speak. He just nodded at the women as they ate. His face showed something Helen could not quite identify. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something gentler. Something that looked almost like sadness mixed with hope. When Helen finally looked up from her empty plate, she found Margaret staring at her. Margaret's eyes were red. Gravy smeared the corner of her mouth. She looked lost. "Why?" Margaret whispered in German. "Why would they do this?" Helen had no answer. She looked down at her plate. She looked at the American soldiers eating and laughing. She looked at the guards standing along the walls. She looked at Lisa, who had stopped crying and was eating with the desperate intensity of someone who had been starving and did not realize it until food appeared. The warmth of the mess hall pressed against Helen's skin. The smell of coffee brewing somewhere in the kitchen mixed with the lingering scent of biscuits and gravy. Outside the windows, snow continued to fall in soft, steady flakes. Inside, German women ate American food and tried to understand what it meant. But understanding would not come from breakfast alone. What these women did not know yet was that in just 48 hours, one of them would meet someone who would shatter every remaining certainty they clung to. Someone whose very existence proved that the world was far more complicated than any propaganda had prepared them for. The cook with red hair came by with a large pot offering seconds. Most women shook their heads, too overwhelmed to eat more, but a few held out their plates. The cook served them with the same pleasant smile. As if this was normal, as if feeding enemy prisoners until they were satisfied was just another Tuesday morning in Wisconsin. Helen watched Lisa accept a second helping. The young woman's hands had stopped shaking. She even managed a small, tentative smile when the cook pointed at her plate and gave a thumbs up. Lisa nodded. The cook moved on. Lisa ate more slowly this time, savoring each bite instead of rushing through it. Margaret pushed her plate away, still half full. She folded her hands on the table and stared at them. Helen recognized that look. It was the look of someone whose understanding of the world had just shifted, and they were trying very hard not to let it show. Margaret was a true believer. She had devoted years to the propaganda machine. She had written thousands of words about American cruelty, and now she had tasted American kindness in the form of breakfast, and it had shaken something loose inside her. The meal ended slowly. Women finished at different paces. Some sat in silence after eating, processing what had happened. Others whispered to each other in low, urgent voices. A few just stared at their empty plates as if the answer to some unspoken question might be written there. Eventually, a guard gestured for them to stand. Time to return to the barracks. Time to continue processing into the camp routine. The women rose and filed toward the door. Helen moved with them, her body heavy with food and confusion. As they stepped outside into the cold, the shock of temperature helped clear her mind slightly. The frozen air burned her lungs. Snow crunched under her thin shoes. She pulled her inadequate jacket tighter and walked across the campgrounds with the other women. But everything looked different now. The barbed wire still enclosed them. The guard towers still watched from above. But the guards in those towers were the same ones who had just watched them eat. The same ones who had offered them seconds. The same ones who smiled and gestured kindly even though every woman in this camp had been until very recently part of a war machine trying to destroy everything they believed in. Helen's mind raced as they walked. She thought about the propaganda films she had seen. Americans torturing prisoners. Americans executing civilians. Americans showing no mercy, no humanity, only brutal efficiency. But the reality she was experiencing was different. Completely, utterly different. Either the propaganda had been lies, which meant everything she thought she knew about her own government was wrong, or this kindness was a trap, which meant the torture was still coming and would be worse because of the false hope they were building now. Helen did not know which possibility frightened her more. They reached the barracks. The women filed inside, grateful for the warmth of the coal stove. Some collapsed onto their bunks immediately. Others gathered near the stove, holding their hands toward the heat. Lisa sat on her bunk and stared out the window at the falling snow. Margaret stood by the stove, but did not seem to see it. Her eyes were focused on something far away. Helen sat on her own bunk and pulled out the one photograph she had managed to keep through the capture and transport. Her sister Anna, 16 years old in the picture, smiling in front of their house in Hamburg. Dark hair pulled back in braids, eyes bright with the kind of innocence that war had not yet touched. The photograph had been taken 3 years ago before everything fell apart. Helen did not know where Anna was now. When the chaos of late 1944 had swept through Hamburg, families had been separated. Anna had been sent to work in a factory somewhere in the countryside. Helen had been pulled into military medical service. They had written letters when they could, but mail had become unreliable. The last letter Helen received had been in October. Anna had written about being cold and missing home and hoping the war would end soon. Helen pressed her thumb against her sister's face in the photograph. Please be alive, she thought. Please be safe. Please forgive me for not being there. A knock at the barracks door made everyone jump. The door opened and a guard stepped inside. The same gray-haired sergeant from the mess hall. He held a clipboard and spoke in English. None of the women understood the words, but his tone was calm and official. He seemed to be explaining something. He gestured toward the door, then pointed at his watch, then held up fingers. 3. Was he saying something would happen in 3 hours? The women looked at each other confused. The sergeant tried again, speaking slower, using more hand gestures. Finally, one woman who spoke a little English from school tentatively translated, I think he is saying we will have medical examinations this afternoon. The sergeant nodded vigorously when he heard her say medical examinations. He pointed at her and gave a thumbs up, grateful someone had understood. He said a few more words, gestured to indicate they should rest until he then and left. The women sat in uneasy silence after he departed. Medical examinations could mean many things. It could be routine health checks, or it could be something worse. The propaganda had warned about medical experiments on prisoners. Helen felt the brief peace from breakfast drain away, replaced by familiar fear. But then she remembered something. During processing yesterday, she had glimpsed an American nurse, A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and gentle hands who had checked temperatures and distributed water. That nurse had looked at the German women with something that seemed almost like sympathy. If the examinations were run by people like that, maybe it would be okay, maybe. Helen lay back on her bunk and stared at the wooden ceiling. The taste of biscuits and gravy still lingered in her mouth. Her stomach felt full and warm. Her body wanted to relax into the comfort of the mattress and blankets. But her mind would not let her. Her mind kept circling back to the same questions. Why are they treating us like this? What do they want? When will the other shoe drop? But underneath those questions, quieter and more disturbing, was another thought. A thought Helen did not want to acknowledge but could not completely suppress. What if this is just who they are? What if Americans really do treat prisoners this way? What if everything we were told was a lie? If that was true, then what had Helen been fighting for? What had her country become? What did it mean that the enemy showed more humanity than her own government had? These were dangerous thoughts, the kind of thoughts that could unravel a person if they let them. Helen pushed them away and focused on the present, one moment at a time. Survive each moment. Do not think too far ahead. Outside, a work detail of American soldiers marched past the barracks. Their boots crunched in the snow in perfect rhythm. Someone called out a cadence. The soldiers responded in unison. The sound faded as they moved on. Lisa finally spoke, her voice small and uncertain. Do you think they will let us write letters home? The question hung in the air. Helen sat up and looked at the young woman. Lisa's face showed such desperate hope that it hurt to see. I don't know, Helen said gently. Maybe, if they follow the Geneva Convention rules. What are those rules? Lisa asked. Margaret answered before Helen could. Her voice was flat, almost mechanical. Prisoners of war are entitled to certain rights: food, shelter, medical care, the ability to send and receive mail, protection from torture and abuse. Many countries signed the agreement, including Germany, including America. But does anyone actually follow it? Lisa pressed. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, We will find out. The three women fell silent again. Helen lay back down. The morning had exhausted her more than any physical labor could have. The emotional weight of the breakfast, of the kindness, of the confusion pressed down on her like a physical thing. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. Her mind kept replaying the moment the food touched her tongue, the moment everything she thought she knew began to crack, the moment she started to suspect that her enemy might be more human than her own leaders had ever allowed her to believe. And in the darkness behind her closed eyes, Helen saw her sister's face. Anna's smile. Anna's trust that her older sister would keep her safe. A trust Helen had failed. Please be alive, she thought again. Please be safe. And please, please forgive me for learning to see our enemy as human. Because that felt like the worst betrayal of all. The afternoon light filtered through the barracks windows in pale yellow streaks. Helen sat on her bunk and watched dust particles drift through the beams of sun. Outside, the temperature had dropped even further. Frost crept across the window glass in intricate patterns that looked almost beautiful if you could forget where you were and why. The medical examinations had been scheduled for 2 o'clock. It was 1:30 now. The women prepared in silence, each lost in her own thoughts and fears. Some changed into cleaner clothes if they had them. Others simply sat and waited. The not knowing was always worse than the actual event. Helen had learned that as a nurse. The anticipation of pain caused more suffering than the pain itself. But what none of these women knew was that the medical examination would reveal something far more shocking than any physical ailment. Something that would force them to confront a truth they were not ready to face. Margaret paced near the stove, her movements sharp and agitated. She had barely spoken since breakfast. Every few minutes she would stop and stare at nothing, her mind clearly working through something. Helen recognized the signs of a person whose worldview was beginning to collapse. She had seen it in patients who received diagnoses that changed everything. The denial, the anger, the desperate attempt to make the new information fit into the old understanding. Lisa sat on her bunk with her knees pulled to her chest. She looked very young in that moment. Too young to be here. Too young to have been pulled into a war machine and spit out on the other side of the world. Her eyes were red again, but she was not crying, just staring at her hands. At exactly 2 o'clock, the door opened. A female American officer entered, followed by a nurse Helen had not seen before. The nurse was in her early 40s with brown hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face had the kind of gentle strength that comes from years of caring for the suffering. When she smiled at the women, the expression reached her eyes and transformed her entire face into something that looked almost maternal. The officer spoke in English, her tone professional but not harsh. The nurse stood beside her with a medical bag in hand. Her name tag read Thompson. Nurse Sarah Thompson. The officer gestured for them to follow. The women stood slowly, reluctantly. Helen moved to the front of the group almost automatically. Years of nursing had trained her to step forward in medical situations. If something bad was going to happen, better to face it first and warn the others. They walked across the frozen campgrounds to a white-painted building with a red cross on the door. Inside it was warm and smelled strongly of disinfectant. Clean, sterile, professional. The walls were lined with basic medical equipment, examination tables with clean white sheets, cabinets with glass doors showing organized supplies. Everything neat and orderly. Nurse Thompson began organizing the women into a line. She touched each woman's shoulder gently as she guided them into position. Not roughly, not with impatience, just simple professional guidance. When she reached Lisa, she paused. The young woman was shaking. Thompson said something soft in English and touched Lisa's forehead with the back of her hand, checking for fever. The gesture was so maternal, so instinctively caring, that Lisa's eyes filled with tears. The examinations began. One by one, women were called into a smaller room. Helen waited and watched. Each woman who went in came out looking surprised, confused, not hurt, not traumatized, just bewildered. Whatever was happening in that room, it was not matching their expectations. When Helen's turn came, she walked into the examination room with her spine straight and her face carefully blank. Nurse Thompson was waiting inside along with a male doctor who looked to be in his 50s. He had gray hair and glasses and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering. When he saw Helen, he nodded respectfully and gestured to the examination table. Thompson spoke to Helen in the slow, clear English. Helen did not understand the words, but she understood the gestures. Sit here. Let me check your temperature. Open your mouth, breathe deeply. The routine of a basic medical examination. The doctor examined Helen with thorough professionalism. He checked her eyes, her throat, her reflexes. He listened to her heart and lungs. He looked at the poorly healed scar on her arm from a piece of shrapnel that had caught her during a bombing raid. His fingers were gentle as he examined it. He said something to Thompson, who wrote notes on a clipboard. Then Thompson opened a cabinet and pulled out supplies. Bandages, antiseptic, penicillin tablets. She handed them to Helen with clear gestures showing how to use them. For the scar, to prevent infection. Helen stared at the supplies in her hands. Penicillin was precious. Even in German military hospitals, it had been rationed carefully saved for the most critical cases. And here was an American nurse handing it to a prisoner for a minor wound that had already partially healed. Thompson said something else and pointed to Helen's thin jacket. She shook her head disapprovingly and went to another cabinet. She pulled out a thick wool coat, American military issue, and held it out to Helen. The gesture was clear. Take this. You need it. The Wisconsin winter will kill you otherwise. Helen took the coat with numb fingers. The wool was heavy and warm, real quality, not the thin synthetic materials Germany had been using since the shortages began. She put it on. It fit reasonably well. The warmth surrounded her immediately. Thompson smiled and patted Helen's shoulder. Then she gestured to the door. The examination was over. Helen could go. Helen walked out in a daze. She was wearing an American military coat. She was carrying American medicine. She had just been examined by American medical professionals who had treated her with more care and thoroughness than some German doctors had shown German soldiers in the final months of the war. The world made no sense anymore. Margaret was called in next. Helen waited outside with the other women who had already been examined. Everyone looked shell-shocked. Several wore new coats like Helen's. One woman held a pair of glasses, her eyes wide with disbelief. Apparently, the American doctor had tested her vision and given her prescription glasses, just like that. No payment, no strings attached. When Margaret emerged, she looked even more shaken than the others. She held a bottle of pills in one hand and a new coat in the other. She walked directly to Helen and grabbed her arm, pulling her slightly away from the group. They gave me medicine for my stomach, Margaret whispered in rapid German. I mentioned I had been having pain, and the doctor examined me and diagnosed an ulcer and gave me medicine. Real medicine. Not substitutes, not ration pills. He gave me a full bottle. Helen nodded slowly. They gave me penicillin for my arm. Why? Margaret's voice cracked. We are the enemy. We are prisoners. Why are they giving us medicine that their own soldiers need? Helen had no answer. They stood together in silence, both holding their new coats and medicine, both trying to process what it meant. Lisa was the last to be examined. When she came out, she was crying again, but this time it was different. Thompson walked beside her with an arm around her shoulders. Lisa clutched a small brown teddy bear to her chest. Thompson must have given it to her from somewhere, some donated items perhaps, because Lisa had arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back. Thompson said something gentle to Lisa and squeezed her shoulder before letting her go. Lisa walked to Helen and Margaret and buried her face against Helen's new coat, sobbing. Helen put her arms around the young woman automatically, the way she had held countless frightened patients over the years. It's okay, Helen murmured. You're okay. But was she? Were any of them? How could anything be okay when nothing made sense anymore? They returned to the barracks as a group. The women who had received coats wore them gratefully. The cold bit less fiercely now. Inside the barracks, they gathered near the stove and began to talk in low, urgent voices. What did it mean? Why the kindness? What were the Americans planning? Some women clung to suspicion. This was manipulation. They were being softened up for something worse. The kindness was strategic, designed to make them compliant before the real cruelty began. But others were beginning to doubt. One woman, a former teacher named Ruth, spoke what many were thinking. What if this is just how they are? What if Americans actually believe in treating prisoners this way? Impossible, someone else said. No country treats its enemies this well. Germany doesn't, Ruth replied quietly, but maybe America does. The words hung in the air like smoke. Helen watched Margaret's face as she listened to the debate. The older woman's expression was tight, controlled, but something flickered behind her eyes. Doubt, fear, the terrible possibility that everything she had built her life around might be a lie. Evening came. Dinner was served in the mess hall. Beef stew with vegetables and thick slices of bread. Coffee that was actually made from real coffee beans instead of the grain substitutes Germany had been using for years. The women ate with less hesitation than at breakfast, though many still looked around nervously, as if waiting for someone to snatch the food away. After dinner, they were allowed to stay in the mess hall for what the guards called recreation time. A radio played American music. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, the big band sound that had been banned in Germany as degenerate American culture. Some of the younger guards moved chairs and tables to create an open space. A few of them started dancing with each other, laughing and joking. They did not seem to care that enemy prisoners were watching. Lisa watched the dancing with wide eyes. She had probably never seen anything like it. In Germany, especially in the last years of the war, joy had become suspicious. Laughter had become rare. Public displays of happiness felt dangerous because they suggested you were not taking the war seriously enough. But these Americans danced and laughed as if the war was already over. As if the outcome was so certain they could afford to celebrate before the victory was even official. One of the younger guards noticed Lisa watching. He was maybe 23 with sandy brown hair and an easy smile. He walked over and extended his hand to her, clearly inviting her to dance. Lisa shrank back, terrified. The guard immediately backed off, his hands raised in apology. He said something in English, his tone gentle and reassuring, then returned to dancing with his fellow soldiers. Helen had watched the entire interaction. The guard had read Lisa's fear and respected it immediately. No insistence, no pressure, just an invitation freely given and freely withdrawn when refused. How many German soldiers would have done the same? Helen pushed the thought away. It was too dangerous, too destabilizing. Margaret stood abruptly and walked out of the mess hall. Helen followed. Outside, the night was clear and brutally cold. Stars filled the sky in brilliant clusters. Margaret stood in the snow, her breath coming out in rapid white clouds. I can't do this, Margaret said without turning around. I can't keep pretending this makes sense. Helen stood beside her. No one is asking you to pretend. Yes, they are. Margaret's voice was sharp. Every kind gesture is asking me to pretend that I was wrong, that my government lied, that I helped spread those lies, that I spent years writing propaganda that convinced people to hate Americans when Americans are. She stopped, unable to finish. When Americans are what? Helen asked gently. When Americans are better than we are. The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but they hit like artillery fire. Margaret covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook. Helen put a hand on her back but said nothing. What could she say? The truth was revealing itself slowly, painfully, and no words could make that process easier. They stood in silence for several minutes. The cold seeped through their new coats, but neither moved to go inside. Finally, Margaret lowered her hands. What do we do now? She asked. We survive, Helen said. We watch, we learn, and maybe eventually we understand. Margaret laughed bitterly. Understand what? That we were the monsters all along. Helen did not answer because she did not know how to answer. The question was too big, too terrible, too true. They returned to the barracks. Most of the women were already back preparing for sleep. The atmosphere was subdued. Everyone was processing the day in their own way. Some wrote in makeshift journals. Others prayed quietly. Lisa sat on her bunk holding the teddy bear, her eyes distant. Helen lay down and thought about the day, the medical exam, the kindness, the confusion. But mostly she thought about what was coming tomorrow. Because tomorrow would bring something none of them expected. Tomorrow would shatter the last of their certainties. Sleep came eventually, but it was restless. Helen dreamed of home, of Hamburg, of Anna. When she woke in the darkness, she could not remember if the dreams had been good or nightmares. Perhaps they were both. The next morning began like the one before. Breakfast in the mess hall. This time it was scrambled eggs and bacon and toast with butter and jam. The bacon was crispy and salty and impossibly good. Helen ate slowly, trying to memorize the taste because part of her still believed this could not last. After breakfast, a guard appeared at their table, the same gray-haired sergeant from before. But this time he was accompanied by another soldier, a younger man, maybe 30, with dark hair and blue eyes. He wore the same American uniform as the others, but something about him was different. The way he stood, the way he looked at the German women with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been understanding. The sergeant said something in English and gestured to the younger soldier. The younger man stepped forward and in perfect unaccented German said, "Good morning, my name is Sergeant James Muller. I have been asked to serve as a translator for you during your time here." The women froze. A collective intake of breath. An American soldier speaking flawless German. It was impossible. It was terrifying. It made no sense. Muller seemed to expect this reaction. He smiled gently. "I know this is surprising. Please do not be afraid. I am here to help." Helen found her voice first. "How do you speak German?" Muller's smile faded slightly. "Because I am German, or my family was. We left in 1920. I was 7 years old. We came to America because my grandfather was a political dissident and the government was making our lives impossible. America gave us freedom, gave us safety, gave us a chance to build a new life." Margaret stood so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You're a traitor." Muller did not flinch. "No, I'm American. My loyalty is to the country that gave my family refuge when Germany wanted us silenced or dead. The country that believes people should be free to disagree with their government without punishment." "Lies," Margaret said, but her voice shook. "America is not free. It is chaotic, without discipline, without order." "Perhaps," Muller said calmly, "but in that chaos I can say that I think the president is wrong and not be arrested. I can read newspapers that criticize the government and the government. I can vote for leaders I believe in. Can you say the same about Germany?" The question hung in the air. No one answered because they all knew the answer. Margaret sat back down heavily. Her face had gone pale. Muller pulled up a chair and sat with them. "I am not here to argue politics. I am here to help you, to translate, to answer questions if I can, to make this transition easier. You are prisoners, yes, but you are also human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity. That is what America believes." "Even for enemies," Helen asked quietly. "Even for enemies," Muller confirmed. "Especially for enemies. Because how we treat our enemies says more about who we are than how we treat our friends." He stood and gestured around the mess hall. You will be given work assignments today. Nothing difficult, nothing meant to punish, just tasks to keep the camp running. Laundry kitchen, help cleaning. You will be paid a small wage that you can use at the camp store. You will have free time in the evenings. You will be allowed to write letters home, though they will be censored for security. This is not cruelty. This is simply how prisoner of war camps operate under the Geneva Convention. Lisa raised her hand tentatively like a schoolgirl. Will we ever go home? Muller's expression softened. Yes. When the war ends, you will be repatriated, sent back to Germany. How long that takes depends on how long the war lasts, but you will go home eventually. He stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. I know what you have been told about Americans, about our cruelty, our barbarism, our godlessness. I know because I heard the same things before my family left. But I want you to watch, observe, see for yourselves whether the propaganda matches reality, then make your own judgment. He left them sitting in stunned silence. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Work assignments were distributed. Helen was sent to help in the medical building with Nurse Thompson. Margaret went to the laundry. Lisa was assigned to the kitchen. The work was simple and the guards were fair. No one was beaten or abused or worked to exhaustion. Helen worked alongside Thompson, organizing supplies and cleaning equipment. They could not speak to each other beyond simple gestures, but they developed a rhythm. Thompson showed Helen where things went. Helen followed instructions. At one point, Thompson pulled out a photograph from her pocket and showed it to Helen. A young man in American uniform smiling at the camera. Thompson pointed to herself, then to the photograph, then made a gesture over her heart. Brother, she had a brother fighting in this war. Thompson's eyes were sad as she looked at the photograph. She said something in English that Helen did not understand, but the emotion was clear. Worry, love, fear, the same emotions Helen felt when she thought about Anna. Helen pulled out her own photograph. Anna, 16, smiling. She showed it to Thompson and made the same gesture. Sister, Thompson looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she looked at Helen. Their eyes met. In that moment, no language was needed. They were two women worried about their siblings in a war neither of them had started. The nationality did not matter. The sides did not matter. The fear and love were universal. Thompson reached out and squeezed Helen's hand. Helen squeezed back. They stood there in the medical supply room, enemy and enemy holding hands in shared grief and hope. Then Thompson released her hand and went back to work. Helen did the same. But something had shifted. Some wall had crumbled just a little bit more. The days began to blend together. A routine established itself. Breakfast, work, lunch, more work, dinner, recreation times, leap, repeat. The pattern was almost soothing after the chaos of the war years. Helen's body began to relax into it even as her mind continued to struggle. She watched the Americans carefully, watched how they treated each other, watched how they argued and laughed and disagreed openly without fear. She saw newspapers lying around with headlines criticizing military decisions. She heard radio programs where different people debated politics loudly. She observed American women walking freely around the camp perimeter, riding bicycles, carrying shopping bags, living lives that looked remarkably normal despite the war. None of this matched what she had been taught about America. None of it fit the propaganda. Every day, the disconnect grew larger. Margaret was experiencing the same thing but fighting it harder. She would mutter under her breath about psychological warfare and manipulation tactics. But Helen noticed that Margaret read every newspaper she could find, studied every headline, absorbed every word of the debates and discussions. Margaret was a propagandist. She understood how information was shaped and controlled. And what she was seeing here contradicted everything she thought she knew about how governments operated. Lisa was the most adaptable, young enough that her beliefs were not as deeply rooted. She began learning English from the guards, started smiling more. The teddy bear Thompson had given her became a constant companion. She was healing in ways that Helen and Margaret could not quite manage yet. Then 3 days after Muller's introduction, the mail arrived. A guard entered the barracks with a canvas bag full of letters. The women crowded around as he called out names. Most of the mail was Red Cross correspondence official letters confirming the women were alive and being held according to Geneva Convention standards. But a few were personal letters from home. Helen's name was called. She took the thin envelope with shaking hands. The handwriting on the front was not Anna's. It was their neighbor, Mrs. Hoffman. Helen's heart sank. If Mrs. Hoffman was writing instead of Anna, something was wrong. She sat on her bunk and opened the envelope slowly. The letter was short. Mrs. Hoffman's handwriting was shaky, hard to read. Helen had to concentrate to make out the words. Dear Helen, I am sorry to write with terrible news. Your sister Anna was killed in the bombing raid on February 3rd. She was walking home from the factory when the siren started. She did not make it to the shelter in time. The blast killed her instantly. I found her body and buried her in the garden behind what remains of your house next to your mother's grave. I marked it with a wooden cross. I am so sorry, Helen. I know how much you loved her. She was a good girl, too young for any of this. I pray you are safe wherever you are. Mrs. Hoffman. Helen read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. February 3rd, she tried to remember what she had been doing on February 3rd. It took a moment to place the date. February 3rd was the day after they arrived at Fort McCoy, the day of the first breakfast. The day she had eaten biscuits and gravy and cried from the overwhelming kindness of it. While Helen had been discovering that Americans could be gentle, her baby sister had been dying under American bombs. The room spun. Helen stood up too quickly and stumbled. Margaret caught her arm, steadied her. Margaret's face was full of concern. What is it? What happened? Helen could not speak. She handed Margaret the letter. Margaret read it quickly. Her face went pale. She looked at Helen with his stricken eyes. Oh, Helen, I'm so sorry. I'm so very sorry. Other women had gathered around. Word spread quickly. Anna was dead. Helen's sister was dead. The women who had received good news from home felt guilty for their relief. The women who had received no news felt grateful they did not have to know yet. Lisa pushed through the small crowd and threw her arms around Helen. The young woman was crying. Helen stood rigid in the embrace, unable to process anything. Her mind had gone blank and white and empty. Then the anger came, hot and vicious and all-consuming. Americans had killed Anna. Americans had dropped the bombs that crushed the life out of a 16-year-old girl who had never hurt anyone. And those same Americans had fed Helen, had given her medicine, had treated her with kindness. How dare they? How dare they be kind after what they had done? Helen pushed Lisa away gently and walked out of the barracks. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to scream, but her throat was too tight. The snow outside was blinding bright in the afternoon sun. She walked without direction, not caring where she went. She ended up behind one of the storage buildings, out of sight of the main camp. She collapsed against the wooden wall and let herself break. The sobs came hard and painful, tearing out of her chest like something physical. She cried for Anna. She cried for her mother, who had died 2 years ago. She cried for Hamburg and for Germany and for everything that had been lost. She did not hear anyone approach. Suddenly, Thompson was there, the American nurse, kneeling in the snow beside her. Thompson did not say anything. She just put her arms around Helen and held her while she cried. Helen wanted to push her away, wanted to scream at her. Your country killed my sister. Your bombs murdered a child. But she could not push away the warmth, could not reject the human comfort even though it came from the enemy. So she cried in Thompson's arms and hated herself for needing the comfort and hated the world for being so complicated that the same people who killed could also care. After a long time, the tears stopped. Helen pulled back. Thompson released her immediately. Thompson's own eyes were wet. She said something in English, soft and full of compassion. Then she pulled out the photograph Helen had seen before. Her brother. Thompson touched the photograph gently, then made a gesture across her throat. Dead. Her brother was dead too. Thompson pointed to Helen, then to herself. Same. We both lost someone we loved. Helen understood. Thompson knew this grief, knew it intimately, and still she showed up every day to care for prisoners. Still she offered kindness. Still she chose to see humanity in the faces of her enemies. How did she do it? Thompson helped Helen to her feet. She walked Helen back to the barracks, one arm supporting her, moving slowly through the snow. At the barracks door, Thompson squeezed Helen's arm once and then left. Helen went inside. The other women were quiet, giving her space. Margaret had made Helen's bunk, smoothing the blankets with care. Lisa had placed the teddy bear on Helen's pillow, a small gesture of comfort. Helen lay down fully clothed. She curled onto her side and stared at nothing. The world had ended again. Just when she thought she might survive, this might make it through the past had reached across the ocean and reminded her that survival was not the same as living. Night fell. Someone brought Helen dinner, but she did not eat. She did not move. She just lay there and breathed and existed in a space beyond thought or feeling. Sometime deep in the night, she felt someone slip into the bunk beside her. Margaret. The older woman put an arm around Helen and held her. No words, just presence. Just the reminder that she was not completely alone. Helen closed her eyes. Sleep would not come, but at least the darkness was kind. At least in the darkness, she could not see the contrast between her full stomach and her sister's grave, between American kindness and American bombs, between the person she had been and the person she was becoming. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready or not. Tomorrow would bring more questions and more impossible contradictions. But tonight, she let herself grieve in the arms of a woman who was learning that truth was more complicated than any propaganda she had ever written. And somewhere in the compound, Nurse Thompson sat in her own quarters and looked at the photograph of her brother and cried for him and for the German girl she would never meet and for all the sisters and brothers lost to this terrible war. She cried, and then she dried her tears and prepared for another day of caring for the enemies who had killed the person she loved most in the world. Because that was what it meant to be human, to hold grief and compassion simultaneously, to understand that the enemy was also someone's sister, someone's daughter, someone's beloved, to choose kindness even when hate would be easier. The war had taught everyone to hate, but places like Fort McCoy were teaching a different lesson, one that would take years to fully understand, one that would haunt these women for the rest of their lives. The lesson was simple and impossible and true. There were no monsters, only humans making terrible choices or good ones. And sometimes the only way to survive was to see your enemy clearly and recognize that you might have been them if you had been born in a different place at a different time. Morning arrived without mercy. Light crept through the barracks windows and found Helen exactly where she had been all night. Awake, empty, somewhere beyond exhaustion into a numb space where nothing could touch her. Margaret had stayed beside her until just before dawn, then quietly returned to her own bunk. The breakfast bell rang. Women rose and dressed. Helen did not move. She heard whispered conversations around her. Someone said her name softly. Footsteps approached and retreated. Finally, Lisa knelt beside the bunk. "Helen, you should eat something. Please." Helen did not respond. After a moment, Lisa stood and left with the others. The barracks emptied. Silence settled like dust. She did not know how much time passed before Thompson appeared. The American nurse entered without knocking her medical bag in hand. She walked directly to Helen's bunk and sat on the edge. She placed a hand on Helen's shoulder, checking for fever with professional efficiency. Then she said something in English, her tone gentle but firm. Helen finally turned her head to look at Thompson. The nurse pulled out a photograph, her brother in uniform. Thompson touched the photograph, then made a gesture across her throat. "Dead." She pointed to Helen, then to herself. "Same. We both lost someone." Thompson opened her medical bag and pulled out a canteen of water and a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. She offered them to Helen. The message was clear. You are not alone in your grief. You must continue anyway. Helen sat up slowly. Her body felt heavy and disconnected. Thompson watched as she ate without tasting, drank without feeling. When Helen finished, Thompson stood. She said something else in English, touched Helen's shoulder once more and left. Helen washed her face with cold water, combed her hair, put on the American coat. The gestures were automatic, meaningless, but they were movement. They were life continuing. When she walked to the mess hall for lunch, the other women looked at her with relief and concern. Margaret brought her a tray of soup. Helen ate because her body required fuel. After lunch, she returned to the medical building. Thompson was there. When she saw Helen, she nodded approval. "Good, you came back." They worked together in silence, the familiar routine providing structure. Days passed. Helen moved through them like a sleepwalker. She ate, she worked, she slept. But she was not really present. Part of her had died with Anna, and she did not know if it would ever return. Margaret watched her with worried eyes but did not push. Lisa stayed close. The community held her even when she could not hold herself. A week passed, then another. March arrived with slightly warmer temperatures. The war news that filtered into the camp suggested Germany was collapsing rapidly. Everyone knew the end was coming. Then one evening in mid-March, an announcement changed everything. The camp commander stood at the front of the mess hall after dinner. Sergeant Mueller translated his words into German. Tomorrow evening, there will be a mandatory viewing in the recreation hall. All prisoners must attend. The film you will see contains difficult content. Content about the war. Content that may be disturbing. But it is important that you see it, that you understand what your country has done, and why we fought to stop it. The women looked at each other with confusion and dread. Mandatory viewings could mean anything. Propaganda, psychological warfare, more lies designed to break them. The next day crawled by. Helen worked in the medical building, but her mind was elsewhere. What would they be forced to watch? What could be so important that attendance was mandatory? Evening came. The women filed into the recreation hall after dinner. The room was set up with rows of chairs facing a white screen. American soldiers stood along the walls, their faces unusually serious. The women took their seats. Helen sat between Margaret and Lisa. The lights dimmed. A projector whirred to life. The first images appeared. Aerial shots of a facility, then closer views. Barbed wire, guard towers, emaciated prisoners in striped uniforms, mountains of bodies. Children's shoes piled in enormous heaps. Helen's breath caught. This could not be real. The title card read, Liberation of Bergen-Belsen Concentration Camp. British Forces, April 1945. But this was March. How could they have footage from April? Mueller's voice came from the side of the room translating the English narration. This footage was shot by British forces when they liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp last week. What you are about to see is real. It is happening in Germany right now. This is what the war has been fought to stop. Last week, not the future, now. The film continued. More camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, each one worse than the last. The camera showed British and American soldiers vomiting at what they found. It showed survivors who could barely stand. It showed children who had forgotten how to smile. It showed the industrial machinery of death, the gas chambers, the ovens, the careful documentation of mass murder. The narrator explained in cold factual detail. The systematic extermination of Jews, Romani people, disabled people, political dissidents. Millions murdered. The numbers were incomprehensible. The images were undeniable. Helen felt her numb cocoon cracking. No, this could not be Germany. Her Germany. The country she had served. This had to be propaganda. Lies designed to make them feel guilty, to break their spirit. But the footage was too detailed, too specific. The British soldiers' shocked faces were too genuine. The survivors' hollow eyes were too real. Beside her, Margaret had gone completely rigid. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. On Helen's other side, Lisa made a small choking sound and covered her mouth. The film showed a Nazi officer being forced to look at the bodies his camp had produced. He turned his face away. A British soldier grabbed him and made him look, made him see. The officer's face showed no emotion, just blank refusal to acknowledge. How many Germans had that same face? How many had known and looked away? The film showed a woman being pulled alive from under a pile of bodies. She had survived by pretending to be dead for 3 days. Her eyes were empty, beyond tears, beyond feeling. Just survival. Margaret suddenly stood. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She tried to walk toward the exit, but her legs gave out. She fell to her knees right there in the aisle. A sound came out of her that was barely human. Not a scream, not a sob, something more primitive. 2 American soldiers moved to help her, but Margaret held up her hand, stopping them. She stayed on her knees, watching the screen, forcing herself to see. Tears streamed down her face, but she did not look away. Helen understood. Margaret had written the words that made this possible. Not directly. Margaret had not built the camps or operated the gas chambers, but she had written propaganda that convinced Germans these people were not really human, were dangerous, were acceptable to eliminate. And Helen had treated wounded soldiers and sent them back to fight, had believed the regime when they said the war was defensive, had accepted everything without seriously questioning. The film was relentless. It showed wedding rings taken from the dead. hair that had been shaved and collected for industrial use, gold teeth extracted and melted down, the complete commodification of human beings. Lisa was crying openly now. Many of the women were. Some sat in shocked silence. Others whispered prayers. A few looked angry, defensive, refusing to believe. When the film finally ended, the lights came up slowly. No one moved. The camp commander stepped to the front. Mueller translated his words. "This is why we fought. This is what we were stopping. You are not our enemies. You are our responsibility now. And when you go home, you must tell the truth about what happened. You must make sure this never happens again." Margaret was still on her knees in the aisle. The commander walked to her and extended his hand. She looked up at him with devastated eyes. He said something directly to her. Mueller translated. He says you cannot undo the past, but you can choose what you do next. Margaret took the commander's hand and let him help her to her feet. The women were dismissed. They filed out in complete silence. Back in the barracks, no one knew what to say. Margaret walked to the center of the room. She was visibly shaking. Then she began to speak. "I wrote the lies. For 8 years, I wrote propaganda. I wrote that Jews were poisoning German culture, that they controlled everything, that they were parasites. I believed it because believing was easier than questioning. And now I have seen where those lies led." She looked around at the other women. "We cannot say we did not know. We knew enough. We knew neighbors disappeared. We knew children stopped coming to school. We knew and we looked away. Our silence gave permission." Her voice broke. "I helped build the ovens with my words. Every article, every speech, every bit of propaganda that made it acceptable to see people as less than human. I did that. I can never undo it, but I can tell the truth now." She sank onto her bunk. "How do we live with this?" Helen stood slowly. The numb cocoon was fully cracked. Pain flooded in, but also clarity. Terrible clarity. Anna had died in the bombing raids. That was real. That was tragic. But the bombs had fallen because Germany had to be stopped. Because if Germany won, the camps would have continued, would have expanded. Anna died because Helen's country had become something that had to be destroyed. Helen walked to Margaret's bunk and sat beside her. "We cannot undo what was done, but we can choose what we do next. We tell the truth. We bear witness. We make sure everyone knows." Margaret shook her head. "Who will believe us?" "Then we make them believe. We tell our families, our neighbors, anyone who will listen." Lisa joined them. "How do I tell my parents the truth?" "Carefully," Helen said, "with patience. But you tell them." That night, Margaret pulled out paper and began to write. Testimony, confession, the beginning of bearing witness. "I will write the truth now," she said. "Even if no one reads it, it is all I can do." Helen watched her write and felt purpose stirring. Germany would need healing when this ended, the kind that only came from facing truth. The next days were different, more conversations, more questions, more willingness to examine old beliefs. The foundation had cracked. Helen threw herself into work. She learned from Thompson, studied American medical techniques, prepared to be useful when she returned home. Margaret wrote constantly, pages and pages documenting her work in propaganda, creating a record that could not be denied. Lisa learned English seriously now. She talked about becoming a teacher, someone who could teach children to think critically, to question. April arrived. Snow melted. Green things pushed through the earth. Then the news came. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Germany had surrendered. The women received the news with complicated emotions. Relief the killing had stopped. Fear about what came next. Guilt about any relief at all. More news followed. Within weeks, they would board ships and return to Europe. But first, there would be one more surprise. One final lesson that Fort McCoy had to teach. The Americans organized a small celebration. Not for victory, for peace, for the possibility of something better. The German women were invited. It felt wrong, but most went. They stood awkwardly while soldiers played music. The contrast was stark. The soldiers celebrated. They had won. They got to go home as heroes. Then something unexpected happened. An American soldier approached Helen. He was older, maybe 40, with kind eyes. He extended his hand, an invitation to dance. Helen's first instinct was to refuse. It felt disrespectful to Anna, to everything. But she saw his face and recognized something. He was not celebrating her defeat. He was offering shared humanity. She took his hand. They danced awkwardly. Helen barely remembered how. The soldier was patient. He led gently. Other couples joined, Germans and Americans. Former enemies moving together to music while spring tried to push through frozen ground. Thompson appeared and pulled Margaret onto the floor despite her protests. Margaret stumbled through the steps, but Thompson just laughed and kept dancing. When the music ended, the soldier placed his hand over his heart and bowed slightly, a gesture of respect, of hope that humanity could survive even the worst of what humanity created. Helen returned the gesture. She walked outside and breathed deeply. Above her, stars filled the sky. The same stars that had watched the camps and the bombs. The same stars that would keep watching as survivors tried to build something better. The ships came in early May. The women packed. Helen wore her American coat and carried medicine from Thompson. Margaret clutched her testimony. Lisa held her teddy bear. Thompson met them at the gate. She hugged each woman goodbye. When she reached Helen, she held her for a long moment. Then she pressed something into Helen's hand, her nurse badge. Thompson touched Helen's badge, then her own chest where her badge should be. The message was clear. We are the same. Nurses, healers, sisters. Helen carefully pinned Thompson's badge to her coat next to her own. Two badges, German and American, enemy and enemy choosing to see each other as human. The trucks pulled away from Fort McCoy. Helen looked back at the camp that had been her prison and salvation. The place where everything she thought she knew had been destroyed and rebuilt into something true and painful and necessary. The journey across the ocean was long. Helen spent most of it on deck, watching the water. Margaret wrote more testimony. Lisa practiced English. When the ship reached Hamburg, Helen barely recognized it. The city was rubble. Her neighborhood was erased. The harbor destroyed. The hospital a shell. She walked through streets that used to be familiar and found only devastation. Survivors lived in basements. Food was scarce. Everything was scarce except grief and the enormous weight of collective guilt. Helen found Mrs. Hoffman living in the ruins of their apartment building. The old woman cried when she saw Helen alive. They sat together in the rubble and talked about Anna. "What was it like in America?" Mrs. Hoffman asked. Helen was quiet. Then she told the truth. "They were kinder than we deserved. They fed us, healed us, treated us like human beings, and they showed us what our country had done." Mrs. Hoffman's face crumpled. "I did not know about the camps." "We all say that," Helen said gently, "but we knew enough to ask questions, and we chose not to. What do we do now? We rebuild, not just buildings, everything. We tell the truth. We teach children to question. We make sure this never happens again." Helen found work at a makeshift hospital. The work was endless and supplies almost nothing, but she used what she had learned in America. The techniques, the discipline, the idea that every patient deserved dignity. Margaret published her testimony. At first, people refused to believe it, called her a traitor. But slowly, as more evidence emerged, the truth became undeniable. Margaret's writing became part of the record, part of the reckoning Germany would spend decades working through. Lisa went back to school and eventually became a teacher. She taught students to think critically, to question authority, to recognize propaganda. She taught in schools built on ruins and tried to make sure the new generation would be better. Years passed. Helen never married. She devoted herself to healing and to preserving Anna's memory. She kept Thompson's badge on her wall next to her own, a reminder of what she had learned, that enemies were human, that kindness was stronger than hate, that truth, however painful, was better than comfortable lies. She received a letter from Thompson in 1953. "How are you? What is life like in Germany now?" "Do you remember the spring we danced?" Helen wrote back. They corresponded for years. Two nurses, two women who lost people they loved, two humans who chose to see humanity in each other. Helen worked as a nurse until her hands were too arthritic. She told her story to anyone who would listen. She never let people forget. In her final days in 1998, surrounded by children of a free democratic Germany, Helen held Anna's photograph in one hand and Thompson's badge in the other. Two emblems of loss and hope. reminders that the worst and best of humanity could exist in the same moment. That truth was always complicated, but always necessary. She died peacefully. And in America, Thompson heard the news and cried for the friend she had known for only months, but carried in her heart for a lifetime. The enemy who became a sister. The prisoner who became a witness. The German nurse who learned in an American camp that humanity was bigger than any flag or border or propaganda could contain. The story ended, but its lessons endured, written in Margaret's testimony, taught in Lisa's classrooms, practiced in Helen's healing work. The truth that set them free was painful, but it was true, and that made all the difference.